Welcome back to Brainwise, Our Lives Decoded. I am your host, Cole Bastian, and I'm joined by my co-host, Phil Dixon. And we're here with episode 5 to kick off, starting to talk about the 5 driving forces of our brain, the first one being protection. And before we dive in, Phil, help catch us up. What's been going on in your life since the last time we spoke and shared with our listeners?
I think everybody knows, or maybe they don't, we're having a kitchen remodel. And they arrived with about 9,000 boxes of cabinetry yesterday. And we're stacked to the gills in this house now. We've got a little couple of rooms that we can actually sit in and have dinner in and things like that. But other than that, it's overwhelming.
Knowing that your kitchen is in a disarray, where are you cooking?
We're cooking through an item called DoorDash. Or Grubhub, I think, is another one of them. Yeah, but DoorDash, we're using a lot of DoorDash or salads.
So you're eating very healthy, or you're getting food delivered, which is probably also fairly healthy. At least you're getting to try. Maybe you're doing a taste and tour of all of the different restaurants around town. I imagine you probably are going to eventually have to circle and start to do the same restaurant multiple times here eventually.
I'm actually having dinner out tonight with the third time we've eaten at this place. We don't have a lot of restaurants in little old Wake Forest here.
Goodness. Hopefully, fingers crossed that the rest of the week will go really well with the kitchen remodel, and that as they move along, it will get closer and closer to being complete.
Joey and we'll invite everybody over for dinner one evening.
Perfect. Excellent. And we'll cook in the kitchen instead of using DoorDash, right? Yeah. Yeah. Or maybe use DoorDash and just eat it in the kitchen. That might be a good idea too, considering after all of the stress that you've gone through, might not want to be cooking too much. Joey and I, we've been having a really good week over the last week. We had our family in town and they left on Sunday. So it was great to be able to catch up with them and spend time with our niece and her mom. We went to the aquarium, which was really, anyone who lives in the Atlanta area, highly suggest you go to the Georgia Aquarium. We had a really fun time. They're doing some really cool different exhibits right now. And being able to experience the different animals in that way is always a unique and fun time in learning about different things. And then, of course, it's back to the normal week of work where things are just getting a little wild. And there's some different things being dropped with Joey's work, going back to work 5 days in office starting January 1, which is an interesting decision. So that was a topic of our conversation this week. And looking at the remainder of the year, because there's a lot of transition happening, as we've shared several times on our podcast, Phil, that I'm in the midst of a fairly significant professional transition. And as things begin to come to a close, what does that all mean? And how are he and I, my husband and I, planning the rest of our year so that way we're taking into account some of this uncertainty that is happening, but then also not allowing it to dictate us all of our future plans. It's been an interesting week, but it's been really good. It's really positive. And I actually referenced many of the things that we talked about in our last episode as we went through this week and talking about change and loss and how does that equate to the same thing and how we can help each other move through that. And so it's really been a really fantastic week, which leads me to, did you have a brain wise or a brain unwise moment of your week this week?
How much of a confessional should this be?
As open as you would like to be, Phil.
So I had a body-to-body contact with a mailbox, except it was the car and the mailbox that had the contratension. And the car lost. We got a big scratch down the side of the car. Of course, it was nothing to do with me that was driving. And you and I talked a little bit about this, and that is one of the things I realized is the amount of things that are going on at the moment in my life. I'm going to introduce a term to everyone. It's called allostatic load. It's the total amount of stress from everything you're experiencing at any point in time. And there is a point in time when it just gets to be too much. And so I think that was my point when I realized, I haven't had a car accident or damaged a car in over 40 years. There's something going on. And so that was the unwise moment. The wise moment was yesterday when things were just getting so overwhelming. And I said to you, now's not the time to do a podcast. I recognized that my brain was just it was in cloud cuckoo land.
I'm so sorry that The car had an unfortunate interaction with the mailbox. Hopefully, it won't be too difficult to get it replaced. But it's interesting sharing that, and that after reflecting on where you were with all of the stress that has been going on in your life, and that was a result of that was the mailbox interaction. I think a lot of people probably don't always realize or recognize when they're hitting their allostatic load, or when it's just too much. It's just there's too much happening, and how can we as individuals be able to recognize that and then respect it so that we can take that time to step back. But then yesterday you were able to see it, and we were able to step back and reconvene the next day to film the next episode of our podcast.
Yep. So what about
Very
your
good.
wise or wise brain moments?
Yeah, so I would say this week I had a brain wise moment as we've been going about our life and all of the different things that are happening for Joey and I. I have a tendency to talk a lot, and to obviously I'm pretty talkative. I don't think that's certainly a surprise to anyone who's listening to our podcast, but my husband, I share a lot of information with him and love to spitball and throw ideas and just go back and forth. But not always is that where they are. And so I recognized, and I'm learning different ways to communicate. And so one of the things that I really wanted to have a conversation around was the amount of where we are in terms of our finances, as well as some upcoming travel we have planned for the year, or travel we would like to have for the year, as well as some additional things that we're trying to save for, and just maybe a party that we might want to throw. And then how does that all get packaged within this transition that I'm going through? And really, it's not just me, it's us, because we're a married couple. And so it's a we transition. And so I decided, instead of loading all of it in just kind of word vomit, I wrote it out in a very sequential order, hoping that'll help guide the discussion, because there's a couple of ideas that I've had that I think might help make things a little less expensive as we move along this journey, but still help us be able to do all the things that we might want to do. So instead of doing what I normally would, which is start having a conversation, get us together, and just start unloading it all, I took the time to really think through, okay, here are the major points that I believe I want to talk about, asked for his input on what he might want to add, and then let's choose a time to talk about it, because there's a lot for us to talk about. And so it's best to be able to have pre-planned time. So normally I probably wouldn't have done that. So I think that was my brain wise moment for the week, is recognizing that there's better ways to communicate with people. And sometimes you have to meet them where they are.
Yeah. And there's a lot of schools of thought about doing that in a brainwise way, which is, even if you plan it, when you actually get to that moment, is it still a good time? Because if it's not, it's much better to put it off again rather than try and force it through when neither of you or both of you are in a stress state or something like that. Good job.
Right.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Yeah. Hopefully it continues. Hopefully it helps make the conversation really successful, because trust me, there have been some unwise brain moments of the past that have led me to being able to make this brain wise decision where I would start having a conversation at 8 o'clock at night that should have probably waited until the next day when we were both more refreshed, and it ended up in a bit more of a dramatic ending than either of us probably wanted it to be. But I'm learning, as we all do, right, as we go along this journey called life.
I came across an aphorism yesterday, which was, failure is a great setup for success. Success is not a great setup for failure. And so you had some failures, and it set you up for success. Great. Good.
It didn't. Exactly. And I'm all about it. Fail fast and learn from it, because that's the way that I'm certainly going to learn as I move along this journey. But today, Phil, we're kicking off a new chapter in our journey through the brain, as we talk about all the different facets and what makes it up, and the information that we're going to be sharing over the course of the next many podcasts, and continuing on as we learn more. But we're moving into what we called, and what we introduced in the very first podcast, is the 5 driving forces of the brain. And we're going to start perhaps with maybe one of the most primal force of all, or one of the ones that is related to threat specifically, which is protection. So whether it's your reaction to criticism at work, or you need to be heard in a relationship, protection drive is quietly calling a lot of shots, and probably more than we might think. And so I think it'll be a really cool conversation for us to dive into today. And Phil, when we talk about protection as one of the brain's driving forces, what do we exactly mean by that?
It's got multiple layers to it. And one is, I think we started off 4 or 5 podcasts ago saying your brain has one drive, and that is your survival. And so protection is really where that comes to the fore, where the brain is looking for how can I best get us to survive? And one of them is through safety. And for example, a paper that was published just a couple of months ago was, let me take a step back. A lot of the research is done on mice because it turns out that mice have a similar brain structure and a similar behavior pattern to ourselves. So that's why we think what we can do is we can look at what's going on in mice and extrapolate why it might be applicable to human beings. And what they found in this particular instance is when mice were physically threatened, they didn't feel safe, physically safe, that response overrode every other desire or need that they have. So it overrode food, it overrode sex, it overrode everything else that possibly could be a driver. We are looking towards everything to be feeling safe. And so we call that protection. And it manifests itself in a number of ways. And I'm going to actually read from the book here, if that's okay. We want to feel physically safe, warmth and shelter. We want to feel emotionally safe in our personal work and our social relationships. Nowadays, we want to feel financially safe. That brings up a similar set of circuitry. We want to, and this is a little stranger, we want to balance what we do for short-term reward versus long-term reward. If you respond just in the short term, then you might put yourself in a survival difficulty for the longer term. So it's a balancing act. Some people need to know where they stand all the time. And 2 things by that. One is where they are in relationship and this, that, and the other. But for some people, it's physically where they sit in a restaurant. So there is a whole group of people that won't sit with their back to the door because they don't feel physically safe. They want to turn around and be able to watch the door. So knowing where you stand, we want to be treated fairly. And I think we've covered some of that in the past, but fairness is a driver. It triggers off the same circuitry in the brain as disgust and a survival mechanism. We want to be treated equally. We want to see other people be treated equally. And that, again, links back to fairness. If I'm not treated equally, it doesn't feel fair. We want to feel resilient. We want to be able to I had a friend of mine once called it bounce back ability. We want to be able to bounce back from things. And obviously, we want to feel healthy. And that's physically, mentally, emotionally, psychologically, we want to feel healthy. So all of those come packaged in that whole concept of protection.
Protection is the core operating system for the brain, and it's not really optional. It's always going to be there. And it probably explains, as for a lot of us as we're listening, relating to at work, why people might avoid feedback or why we might stay stuck in safe roles versus taking risk and going into a role that might stretch us, but it doesn't feel as safe. Or in relationships, probably is to some degree why we hide our feelings, because the more vulnerable we are, obviously, the more unsafe we might feel, or why we might shut down in conflict, or why some people might cling to control more than others do. So I just think it's really interesting how it can probably show up and manifest in various ways for us in all areas of our life in order to really be able to feel like we're protecting ourselves.
It manifests itself in lots of ways. And one of the things we talk about at some point is courage. And yet, if you look at the definition of courage, it's all over the map. Some people who are absolutely willing to go down a zip line or parachute out of an airplane don't have the courage to actually challenge an opinion in a meeting. And so we're all different, and it all comes under this big package of we want to feel protected.
Right. Interesting. And you say the brain is constantly asking, am I safe? How does that question show up in everyday behavior?
We're ready. So how it manifests itself is, first of all, it's often going on we're not aware of it. It's going on non-consciously. Mm-hmm. But if we don't have sufficient information about a certain situation, and I think we've covered this before, what we call make shit up. Oh, did I say that?
Okay. People can fill in their own word.
Make stuff up. And the brain is really good at it, and it will connect the dots even to the point where it makes stuff up that it knows it's not necessarily true. And then the conscious brain convinces ourselves that there's a rationale behind it and convinces itself it's true. So we'll make up a story and then we'll run with that story. And because the way that we've got more detectors in the brain for threats than rewards, we tend to make up negative stories. Not everyone, obviously we're all different, but on average, we tend to make up negative stories of what is going to go wrong. Some people, we call them catastrophizers, are really good making up story about the worst case scenario that can possibly happen about everything. And so that's how it tends to manifest itself.
Interesting. It totally makes sense. I keep relating it back to what I'm going through in my professional life, but there's just so much that's happening there. There has been a lot of I've been making stuff up, or fill in the more colorful word in the middle if you choose, but I have, and so have so many others. And one of the things that I made a really strong recommendation on early on is how can we, even in the lack of knowing all of the answers, as a leadership team, provide as much information as possible so that way that gap or that the amount of information that is uncertain becomes less, so that way the story, the catastrophizing stories that some people might put together, or the more negative, we can help to somewhat subvert, help that not to happen, or to some degree ensure that we're giving people enough information, or even for myself, having enough information so that I'm not going to the worst case scenario. Because to me, it also sounds like another way of saying it is we're making a mountain out of a molehill. And that's a very common phrase that a lot of people use.
And so one of the things that's important for us to remember is that although we're focusing today on protection, and there's 9 different elements which I described, they are all going on in parallel with all the other driving forces. So when you're talking about feeling protected, and the descriptions you were saying, hey, we as leaders need to give people some feeling of safety. Their safety is going to feel safety is by an element of prediction. If you can't give somebody an answer as about what is going on, then you can make them feel safe by giving them an answer about when you will have the answer for them. Right. And so that our brain goes, oh, okay, I can predict that on August the 24th, I'm actually getting the answers I'm looking for.
And so you mentioned, Phil, that protection can also be triggered in the presence or absence of actual threat. Can you explain what that means?
It's a sort of another part, it's another facet of making stuff up. The threat may not be real, it may be perceived, and it may be as a result of that loop we went through, is we don't have the information, we make stuff up, and therefore we now believe the story to be true. And the thing to do, we have in our heads, we have a thing called the Ladder of Inference. Have we ever talked about that? I don't know whether we have.
I don't think so.
So an event occurs, and let's say it is something like, oh, you've got a new CEO. That's the event. And he or she then gives you a quick presentation. We hear all that stuff through our own experiences and this, that, and the other, but our brain isn't smart enough to remember all the detail. There's a few people can, but very few. So what we do is we condense it into some generalized principles or the gist of what they're saying. And then we take that gist and we make a conceptualization from it. The conceptualization, this new CEO may have said, hey, I'm going to take us into new markets. All right. Now the concept is, oh, this guy is an adventurer, or she is an adventurer, or a risk taker. All right. And then we put an inference behind that. And therefore, that's going to mean we're going to be expanding into, you fill in the blank. And yet the only thing that he or she said was, we're going to enter new markets. And so we extrapolate and we make inferences about things from a very limited amount of data. And just out of interest, what happens is I'll make a set of conceptualizations and inferences based on my experience. You'll do a set of inferences and experience based on yours. And then we argue at the inference level, as opposed, and that's where conflict can often come down from, as opposed to going, let's go back to what was actually said, of what the actual event was, and then cut out all that other MSU inferences, concepts, and things like that. Go back to the raw data.
And it's interesting as you were describing that, Phil, because from a psychological perspective or in therapy, one of the things that we talk about a lot is, especially when talking to your spouse, and that same, you'll remember things so differently in terms of the conversation that was being had. And it's probably because we're inferring or we're hearing things. And obviously, there's probably emotion. There's a lot of things that are happening. And one of the things that we use as a strategy to help people is, okay, we'll take a step back and look at what is the end goal here. And does it matter the actual words that came out in that particular conversation, different than what you were describing with the CEO and the factual information that came out of the CEO description? But on the relational side, what's the end goal? Can we get to the end goal, and can we agree that maybe there was just a misunderstanding? And most often times, if you're able to do that and just be able to take a step back and say, okay, the goal is we want to figure out how to save money, or the goal is we want to do X. Let's just take a step back and stop trying to, because, well, you said this or you said that, and we end up going back and forth and playing ping pong, when really it was probably just how we inferred or interpreted the information to be very different than the other person. And in the relational side of it, it probably doesn't really make a tremendous difference. It's what's the goal? Can we get to the ultimate goal, which is whatever the root of the conversation was about? And then, of course, ensuring that along the journey, we're showing up in a really positive way for our spouse and or our significant other. And the best way to do that is just being able to say, you know what, maybe we just had a misunderstanding. And how can we move towards the ultimate collective goal that we have as a couple?
When your brain is put into a threat state, we've got cortisol flushing through the brain. There's certain things that the brain cannot do. And quite often, it reduces our empathy, it reduces our self-control, it reduces our rational thinking. All of the things that we want to be able to have at our fingertips when we're in a relationship. Cortisol takes anywhere between 2 and 5 hours to dissipate in the brain, depending on your metabolism. So sometimes it's best to recognize that's what is brainwise to go, you know what? My brain is not in the right space at the moment, and nor is yours. Let's just put it to one side for a couple of hours, and we'll come back when we both got our brains fully working again.
Because then you're going to have a more productive conversation and probably be able to focus on what the goal is versus he said, she said, I remember, you remember, and ultimately just get to the root of what you're trying to accomplish. Phil, I think as another thing that you've talked about or that we've gone into a little bit of discussion on, I think will be interesting to share with our listeners is the 5 Fs. Fight, flight, freeze, tend, and befriend, which the F for those who are listening is in the befriend word, and faint. Number one, what are they? And if you could give us a synopsis or an overview of what they are, and then how do they show up in modern life and leadership?
So they actually come up in a sequence. And so I'll go historically, and that is most people have heard the fight or flee, which is 2 of the approaches. But the general principle now is that came about as a result of the fact that most men doing neuroscience or science of any sort, it was men, and they were doing research on men, and very often in the Western world. And so that we've got a paradigm that boxed it in. And so fight and flight became the 2 that were most well known. If you go back a million years, and that may have been true for the male population, it may not have been true for the female population. Because in those days, females, we don't know their size, but they're probably slightly smaller. And by the time they were in their early teens, they probably had some kids. So fighting and fleeing, probably not optimal strategies. And what they would probably have done, and again, we have no data to support this is theory, what they probably would have done is actually negotiate. And that's where the phrase tend and befriend come from. And that's where the F is. So there's probably for females and to an extent males, there might have been a negotiating phase. How it shows up in our modern day business world, for example, is if somebody disses an idea you have, or if somebody is rude to you in a meeting, you tend to look around, where are my friends? You look for people who are going to be on your side. So there's the first layer that actually tends to happen is the tend to befriend, then fight or flee. Then if the brain feels particularly even more threatened, we'll go into a state which we call freeze. It's like deer in the headlights. I close down, I can't think what to do next. And then if it's so threatening, then what will happen is we will actually faint and pass out because the brain says, let's shut down all the systems in case we're in really deep doo-doo. I think that's a technical term, by the way.
I think it is too. I think a lot of people are going to recognize it.
Yeah, it's
and I think
a deeply neuroscientific term.
We did say that we were going to avoid a lot of technical jargon, so we might have to cut that one out, Phil. Oh, goodness. And I think it's interesting because we oftentimes tend to, I think most people anyways, especially with the first three, the fight, flight, or freeze, we tend to associate those with trauma response a lot of times or crisis. But based off what you're just describing, it's not related to that. It can be related to a multitude of different perceived threats that are coming in into what we're interpreting versus it just being something that's related to trauma or a crisis that we're experiencing at that time.
Yeah, and if anyone is interested in going into more detail, it's well described in a book called The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk. Really, somewhere about 30 or 40 pages in, he's got a couple of pages where he really well describes what's going on in the brain. So it's a very deep, non-conscious process that goes on.
And we'll be sure to put a link to that in the show notes so that those who might want to go and check it out, you have easy access to get the exact copy that we were just describing, or Phil was just describing. And Phil, you say that, and you were just describing it, that most protective behaviors are non-conscious. So how do we become more aware of our own protective patterns if they're in the non-conscious part of our brain or happening there?
A couple of ways. One is, and I recommend this to everybody, is keep a journal. It doesn't matter whether you're a neuroscientist or a therapist or even probably the world's best known leadership guru, Peter Drucker. He advises everybody to keep a journal because you can do by keeping a journal, especially if you keep a journal about what decisions you were faced with, what actions you took. And then over a period of time, over multiple years, you can start looking for those patterns that may have caused you. Why did I make that decision? I was fearful of X or whatever it might have been. So becoming aware, that's one way of becoming aware in a post hoc manner. In real time, catching yourself in the moment-to-moment decisions. There's one school of thought that says, by the way, your brain never makes a wrong decision for the interpretation it has of your environment at that particular moment. Now, that environment might change 2 seconds later. Our brains are actually pretty good at making a decision to keep us in survival mode. So catching yourself as you're driving home, or for those people working at home, as you close down at the end of the day, it's not a bad idea to step back and go, oh, what happened? What could I have done differently today? And some of those will start to bring out those patterns of behavior, those things, protection. There is a big, well-known saying, everything you want's the other side of fear, and protection is the opposite side of the coin to fear.
It's interesting because from a personal perspective, I think a lot of times people can probably when they're at work, they can see where they're probably in some of those patterns. Maybe they're over preparing, or you're always volunteering, but not ever delegating. Obviously, that shows that there's a protective instinct that's happening or what have you. But then personally, I think it also becomes a part of the conversation when some people, if you're withholding intimacy or withholding emotion, that's a fairly common protective pattern for a lot of people that I don't think they're always aware is a way of, or a form of protection. And what that does to not only whomever it is they're romantically or intimately involved with, but then also how it's impacting them from a psychological perspective. Or it could be the reverse personally, where someone is constantly seeking out and looking for reassurance because they feel unsafe in something that's been going on. And so recognizing what those protective patterns are is, you were just describing through journaling or asking ourselves those questions, doesn't mean we necessarily have to change them right away, but naming them can then help us give an opportunity to pause in the future before reacting when we actually experience them or they come up in our life.
Yep, that's good. And the naming part of it is important, but naming what's going on, naming the emotion that you might be feeling.
And Phil, in the same vein of protection mode, what does it look like when a whole group or maybe a whole organization is stuck in protection mode?
Well, what it looks like is the organization stagnates, won't move forwards, not creative, not coming up with new ideation, resistance to change. And it can be come up not willing to actually speak out your truth. And there's, I forget the name of it now, there's an old adage in the OD world called the road to Toledo. It's where there's a group of people, it's a hot Texas afternoon, and no one knows what they want to do. And someone says, let's go to Toledo. And everyone goes, oh, okay. And they have a terrible time. And on the way back, they say, well, I didn't want to go anyway. Nor did I. And they all realized that they were on this road going down a track, and nobody had said, let's not go there, because nobody wants to rock the boat. That's how it can show up in business. Nobody wants to sit down and say, the emperor's got no clothes, or let's explore why that idea is a good idea or not. And it's a thing called groupthink, which is fairly well documented. And even when some of us, and the studies show that even when you're absolutely sure about something, if you're given enough people around you that say, no, it's the opposite, then we tend to close down. And I don't want to get political at the moment, but there's a lot of that going on in and around us in politics at the moment. We tend to close down, even though we probably should be saying something.
Absolutely. It's interesting because as you were describing it in families, it could also seem like there's this tension under the surface where everything's fine, but no one really actually wants to say how they feel. So very similar to organizations, but then also can show up very similarly in families. And something that stood out in my mind is that when protection dominates, innovation dies, and emotional connection erodes, which can be a really powerful force in the negative for organizations or for families or for couples if you're constantly in that state, because you're either organizationally, as you were describing, innovation is going to die, but then in the familial setting or in the more personal side, your emotional connection is going to erode, which is really important for families and for couples to have this powerful dynamic and to really be able to feel like they're connected and be able to move forward in life and address challenges that are coming forward. I think it's interesting because it sounds also like the energy becomes about self-preservation and maybe not shared progress.
Yeah, and it becomes stagnation. That's the biggest word I can look at. And it's not an easy way out. And it comes out, the way through it is to start asking questions in what I call positive directional questioning. And that is, what would have to happen in order for fill in the blank? What would have to happen for us to be more creative? What would have to happen for us to feel like we're psychologically safe in this team? What would have to happen? And the brain responds to future positive far more than addressing God, ain't it awful in the negative.
Yeah. And you mentioned psychological safety just now, Phil. What's the connection between psychological safety or safety and performance from a brain perspective?
First of all, when people feel safe, their brain is more likely to not be in a threat state and, in fact, be in a receptive to reward and positivity. And so there's a famous study done, I think it was in 2014 by Google, that identified that psychological safety was the single most important thing for high-performing teams. So when teams felt that they could say what they needed to say, that they had some Gallup study was, if you have a best friend at work, you're more likely to be engaged in what's going on. There's all sorts of studies that have happened about the need to feel psychologically safe at work. And so the brain needs to feel safe. You're much more likely to come up with new ideas, be creative about problem solving, not stress about things. The list goes on about the impacts of not feeling safe at work. And 100% parallel in the spousal or environmental or the environment at home.
Oh, absolutely. Because people that I've talked to or coached throughout my career, there's almost always, especially when performance is starting to die down or people are feeling a lack of connection at home or whatever it is, oftentimes it's rooted in not feeling psychologically safe, even though maybe, and this probably applies more specifically to the spousal environment or being at home. Most of the time we are, not always. I certainly don't want to speak to everyone's experience, but a lot of times we are. There's just things that have predominated the relationship that have shown up that tend to help us or tend to guide us to a space where we don't feel psychologically safe. And so then how do we begin to unwind that? And as a couple, begin to show up differently so that we're not being triggered into that space. So that way we can create psychological safety.
You were talking earlier on today about a meeting that you've been in where there was one
Mhm.
character who shall remain nameless who dominated the conversation. And that can create the rest of the team into going into a lack of psychological safety. They don't feel that they're heard. They don't feel like they've got a space. Their voice is not heard. They're not in control. All of those type of things. We call that it's a strong level of advocacy or telling. Those people that tend to dwell in that space of dominating conversations, etc., can drive a team into or out of psychological safety.
Oh, yeah, I saw it play out in real time. I think there were only 3 possible people who talked on that call, and there were probably 3 dozen individuals who were in that particular meeting, but only 3 had predominating conversation. And so you could see it. People probably had opinions otherwise as to what the conversation and the topic that was being discussed, but didn't feel psychologically safe enough to open up and share what their perspective was. So I saw it play out in real time.
And we will, at a podcast in the future, we'll talk about how to have meetings like that where you can create psychological safety and you can get all of the ideas out on the table, even from those people who are the most introverted. And there are brainwise ways of doing that.
Absolutely. Especially because there's a lot of people who want to do that. Maybe the particular person we're talking about who will remain nameless maybe might not want to practice those things that we're going to share, but majority of the people who are listening to our podcast, I think, do want to follow our Brainwise tips or want to learn them. And so especially if there's an interest and a desire to growth, then there are ways, as Phil was describing, to being able to do things to create that space for people.
Yeah. He or she probably isn't listening to our podcast.
Oh, definitely not. And that's okay too. We probably won't be everybody's cup of tea. And that's all right. And Phil, trust oftentimes equated with safety and being psychologically safe in relationships and at work. Trust is a signal of safety. So what builds trust and then what breaks it from a brain point of view?
It's a really long answer, and I suspect that what I'm going to do now is give you a small answer, and then I think maybe what we should do is a podcast on trust and building trust.
Yeah.
There's a couple of ways of looking at it. One is when you've got somebody that you're working with, and you've started working with them. Do you have a tendency, as a mentor of mine once said, is your trust bucket full or is your trust bucket empty? Do you start off with, I don't trust you and you've got to earn it? Or do you start off with, I trust you and you can lose that trust? Your starting off point is an important one. Relationships tend to be more successful if you start off trusting the other person. And then you ask the question, what happens if we lose trust? And the answer to that is depends on the next step. Because if you can actually have a conversation about why that trust got lost, you can actually increase the level of trust. If you don't have the conversation, then it will spiral downhill. And it can spiral downhill very rapidly in a number of ways. And that is because of what we talked about, ladder of inference. If somebody has reduced your trust in them, and then we all start to go, what's the concept and what's the inference? Therefore, I'll never be able to trust them. That tends to be the one little thing goes wrong, I'll never be able to trust them. And so there are techniques for having those trust conversations. can go into them now, or we can have a separate podcast on them if you want.
Yeah, I think why don't we give everybody one nugget on being able to rebuild trust? Because I think it'll be interesting. And then we can certainly, I think, having a full conversation around or full discussion on a podcast episode on building trust will be really important because it is critical. Because the one thing that comes to my mind, Phil, is that from a personal perspective, anyways, that, from building trust, or even if it's in a repair of trust mode, is it means doing what you say that you're going to do and then owning it when you don't, because we're not always going to be perfect at the things that we say we're going to do. For example, I sometimes, in especially the heat of a conversation, have a tendency to interrupt and not allow the other person to finish their particular thought. And so even though I've committed to, and I've said, okay, I'm going to really work on not doing that, and I've improved, there are also times when I'm going to regress. And so then I have to own that and continue committing to the improvement process. And so I think that ownership part on when we don't follow through with what we've said we're going to do becomes really critical, because if we don't own it, or we try to rationalize it or explain it away, is then when it becomes even more broken.
Yeah, so let's talk about some very specifics, and then I'll talk about a little bit more general. One of the things that we tend to do is we go back and forth between the use of words, because words are important and can convey trust or lack of trust. And again, this is going on at a non-conscious level. And if I turn around and I say that I do so and so, and then there's a point in time when I go to, you always do this. We don't mean you do it. We mean the general you. If you look at why we go into that moment, because we don't like what we're saying or doing, and we tend to push it away by using you rather than I. When you can change that into an I and ownership of it, a couple of things happen. First of all, it builds trust with the other person, and what it can also do is bring out emotion in yourself. So be very careful about when we use the word I versus you. And again, we can go into that in a lot more detail, but that's one thing. The second thing is the use of the passive tense rather than an active tense. And I remember running a session where we explored all these things, like the milk bottle broke. It's true, it did, as opposed to I dropped the milk bottle. It's a sense of, if you go passive, there was a lot of traffic out. I was late to work. I did not get up early enough. So all those things that are small little phrases can actually build up over time and cause people to lose trust. At some level, it's self-honesty, self-accountability, all those type of things. But let's go back to what can happen. How can you actually have those trust conversations? And what I'm about to say only works if you are in an environment which in general feels psychologically safe. And that is to basically, and I can't do this exercise in real time, but what you do is you have a mental note, or you can write it down on a piece of paper. On a scale of 1 to 10, I trust this person, and give it a number. And if it's 10, they could hang you out of a window by your feet and still you trust them. If it's a 1, then you don't want to be in the same room as them. And be honest with yourself. Where is it? It's a 4. Why is it a 4? And answer that question. And then it's what's the benefit to both of us to actually increase it from 4 to, and I would never say to 10, because a lot of people can't get there in their head. But what would the benefit of it getting halfway from where you make the assessment to 10? So if it's a 4, what would have to happen in order for it to get to a 7? And then what I request out of you and what I choose to do out of it. And so it can be a structured conversation like that. But again, that only tends to work if you've got a psychologically safe environment to do. And I'll give you an example, one that I experienced many years ago, and that was I had a colleague in my team that I was on, and I didn't particularly trust him, and I gave him a 3. And when we sat down, and this is a two-way process, by the way. One of you goes first, and then the other one goes first. It goes second. And I said to this guy, I don't trust you. I'm giving you a 3 because you intimidate me. He burst out laughing and he showed me his paper and it was exactly the same. And he said, I trust you a 3. Oh, it might have been a 4. I can't remember, because you intimidate me. And so it was amazing. And we actually became the best of friends as a result of that one conversation. And I haven't spoken to him in probably 8 years, but I do know if I phoned him up now, he'd welcome the call.
Very interesting. That's a great practical tool as you go into having trust rebuilding conversations or being able to just take that first step, because trust is extremely important as we look at safety and protection. And Phil, let's flip the lens for a moment, or flip perspective. If I personally am someone who gets triggered easily into protection mode, what can I do to calm my system in the moment? What are some strategies or best practices?
Oh, the best strategy is avoidance. If you know that there's situations that tend to cause you to get triggered, avoid those situations. I'm not being flippant here, but if you can, that's if you think you always get triggered by going to coffee with these two people and something happens, don't go to coffee. I'm not being flippant there at all. We can't always avoid those situations. It just is. But the second thing is catch yourself. I think we talked about deep breathing. If you can do 2 minutes of deep breathing before you go into those situations, you're less likely to get triggered. Not guaranteed.
Right.
The other one, again, it works for some people, doesn't work for everybody. I think we may have talked about circuit breaking, and that is have an image which is pre-implanted in your head, visual image of something, that if you find yourself going there, you bring that image up. And this applies, this doesn't matter whether it's around protection or any of the other driving forces. If you can, so there's 3 practical reasons or practical ways you can take a look at not getting triggered. And again, it's so ingrained for many of us that it's very difficult to tamp it down. The other thing is it's what can you do to prevent it? What to do in the moment, and what can you do to recover? And the recovery side of it can be around getting out of the situation, being on your own for 2 hours, going and walking in nature, if you can. All those type of things will tend to readjust your view of what just happened.
Yeah. The other thing that was coming to mind, especially in the moment as someone is experiencing being triggered into protection mode, is how to orient ourselves to the present. Because you are in the present, you're in the moment. Is it necessary to be triggered? Is it necessary to be so focused on being safe? Are you in an environment that is not safe? And hopefully the answer to that question is you are in a safe environment at the time. And so how do you orient yourself to the present? By picking an object and remembering where you are, reminding yourself, okay, today is today, whatever it is that's going to allow you to be able to do that, to then hopefully bring yourself out of being in that protection mode or being triggered or at that heightened level or in that heightened state.
So I will give you, this is a real life example. Again, no names to protect the innocent. But some time back, I was dealing with a group of people and they were having to develop a series of recommendations for the senior team, for the executive team. And there were 7 people in the group and there were 7 recommendations. And so it was very easy. I said, we're going to take one recommendation, each of you, and that's what you're going to present. There was one guy that said, oh, no, I can't do that. I said, can I work with you for a moment as a coach? And he said, sure. I said, so why not? And he said, I might fail in my presentation. All right, fear of failure. So I said, if you fail, what's the very, very worst thing that could happen? And he said, they could not like me and fire me. And I said, okay, what's the worst that would happen then? Oh, I'd have to go out and get another job. Could you do that? Yeah, it's pretty easy. So what's the worst that can happen? And at that moment, he turned around, and I won't tell you these exact words because I'd have to swear, But he turned around and said, I'll do it. Because our
Mm-hmm.
brain, again, MSU, makes stuff up of that trajectory, the inference, all those things. We
Mm-hmm.
project the fact that there might be something bad to happen, and therefore I'm not going to. In that case, he wasn't going to do the presentation. He did the
Right.
presentation. It went off fine, by the way. So if anyone
Right.
who was worried out there, he actually
Yeah.
he finished up 4 years later, becoming getting a major promotion. Let's just put it that way.
That's awesome. Good for him. And being able to see and work through and answer those questions and realize that it's not the worst case scenario that we're coming up with isn't always going to be that's not always going to be what happens. And Phil, one of the things that I think is important for us to think about too is that there's a role that early experience plays in how strong our protection drive is. So, can you help us understand what role that does play in terms of our early experience in driving how strong our protection drive is in our current environment today?
There's all sorts of interesting theories about that, about how much genetics influence you. And the researchers say anywhere between 38 and sometimes as much as 50% of our drive is driven by genetics. You can pick up, I don't mean you, researchers pick up on whether somebody tends to be protection oriented at a very early age, within hours. Certainly in the very early growth stages, we can see it in kids, whether they tend to be neurotic, scared of everything going on. And so that's going to be somebody that probably grows up feeling getting triggered pretty drastically. The second part is all of the influences and your upbringing. I was asked about a year ago to do a presentation on the neuroscience of poverty. And poverty has a huge impact on our abilities at a later point in time. So, number one, genetics. Number two, your background. Number three is your current situation. What's going on with you right now? We're having the kitchen done, which is in some level is no big deal, but it caused my brain to go into a threat state because of the chaos that was going on around me.
Right.
Long answer to your question, but it has a significant impact. It's one of our purposes in doing these podcasts is to help you become an expert in you. So the more you can understand yourself, the more you can actually
Right.
go, this is why this is happening.
Phil, one of the things I think that to help us wrap up this discussion on protection is how do we help lead others at home or at work, both professionally and personally, when you know that their brain might be operating from a protection state?
Creating an environment where you enhance people's feeling of safety. For example, if you came to me and said, I'm feeling down about so and so, and I turn around and say, well, you'll soon get over it, that's going to make matters actually slightly worse for you. So legit, that may actually be how I feel. But rather than that is how can I best help is always a good response. So create anything you can do to create somebody's feeling of safety increase rather than safety decrease. And there's lots of specific ways you can do that. One, most of them come out of what and how questions. So if you think of putting things in a what or how question, what would have to happen in order for your sense of well-being to improve? Or how can I assist in where you want to go next? And how questions tend to be brain-friendly, brain-wise questions.
And the other thing that was coming to my mind as you were describing that is around empathy, because empathy really does help people to feel more psychologically safe, especially if they're experiencing a high degree of emotion or they're being triggered. But empathy is simple in saying it, but more difficult for some in actually being able to carry it out. And so there's a simple phrase that I think if you fill in these two blanks and then imagine at the end of the phrase there's this period, it will allow you to be able to demonstrate empathy successfully to help that person be able to move forward in whatever it is that you're trying to talk about or wherever it is that you're going next. And that's, I understand that blank may have you feeling blank, period. And the first blank is obviously the situation or the context that they are going through or the perceived situation or context. And then the second blank is the connected feeling that you are seeing them or experiencing them demonstrate or express or that they physically have said or verbally have said to you. that they are experiencing. And it allows that person to be able to feel heard, to feel validated, because validation, I think, is another thing that is extremely important in this context as we're describing this, Phil. And then I think the other part that is of critical importance, especially in empathy, is when you use that phrase, I understand that blank may have you feeling blank, you put a period at the end. Because a lot of times, at least in my experience in coaching leaders, even some fairly high level leaders, they will tend to put a transitional phrase on it or transitional word like but or however or therefore. And by doing that, you've essentially just eliminated everything you did prior to the transition word. You've just basically negated it all and said, you know what, I really don't care how you feel. What's more important is what I'm trying to talk to you about or what I'm seeing being demonstrated. And so you want to put a period there, pause, and then move into whatever the next part of that conversation is, especially if it's a work discussion where you're trying to have a performance discussion or whatever it might be. At home, that might just be the end of the discussion. You might not need to have any other type of conversation, just to use that empathy statement. And then, as Phil was describing in our last podcast, I think he even just said it now, is how can I support you? What can I do to help navigate through this or help you navigate through this? So that way you're putting some ownership in their hands to help you know what to do to best support them.
Yeah. And so whole new subjects, which I'd love to dive into. Them I'll pick up on is that period you said. And what tends to happen for many people is there's silence. And many people are uncomfortable with silence. And so part of what many people want to do is then go and fill the silence up with something,
Right.
as opposed to sitting in the silence and letting the other person respond however they want to respond.
Right.
And you, again, if you watch what's going on TV interviews at the moment, people will ask a very good question. What do you think about so-and-so? And then they'll fill in the question. They'll fill in the answer for them. Do you think it's so-and-so? Do you think it's so-and-so? Do you think it's so-and-so? Which, by the way, is 3 anchoring events into that person's brain. So using silence for the advantage of the relationship.
And sometimes you're allowing the other person to just process what has been said to them.
Yeah.
Too, because at least in my marriage, I'll demonstrate empathy or he might, and then we'll move on in the conversation so quickly, even though we may not have used a transitional word, but we moved on so fast, we haven't had time to process that empathy was demonstrated. And then we just spiral sometimes. And so the moment of allowing the silence can be a really powerful tool to reflect or to allow the other person to be able to move forward in the discussion and even be able to recognize what's just happened.
And we will, for anybody who wants to, we're going to be talking about the different layers of listening and how to become an expert listener.
I love it. Phil, as we close up today's episode, or before we say a bid adieu to all of our friends and listeners that are tuning in today, how would you like to summarize what we've talked about? And of course, we're going to end with how they can use this information that's been shared to decode their life. We do have a couple of listener reflection questions or listener prompts that we'll go through here in a moment. But how would you like to summarize what we've talked about today, and how can they use this to decode their life?
First of all, it's very innate to all of us. There's nothing wrong with you if you find yourself being triggered in terms of protection. We haven't talked much about the layers of the brain, but the response to feeling threatened from a safety point of view is at the very lowest, just above the brainstem. In the reptilian brain, that's where it all hangs out. And so it's not you, it's your brain. So if you can step back and go, okay, what is it? What are the patterns that cause me to get triggered in the protection mode? And when we've gone through the first 3 of these, we'll talk about some other more detailed ways of helping you understand what your particular threat profile is.
Mm-hmm. It is true. There is nothing that's wrong. It's just a part of who we are. We're all triggered by something different. And then how we then choose to move forward once we recognize it. And a couple of questions. And of course, by no means do you have to reflect on all of these, but simply pick 1 or 2 that really stand out to you. But we have a few that we want to share with you today as you think and recap on today's episode. over the next week or two, and you begin to apply this information to decode your life. What does safety mean to me personally? And how do I know when I feel it? When I feel threatened emotionally, socially, or psychologically, what's my default response? Where in my life or work am I holding back because of protection? And what's the story my brain might be telling me? Whose protective patterns frustrate me most? And how might I see them as a response to fear, not defiance? What's one small way I can signal safety to someone else this week? When I look back at my earliest environments, what did they teach me about what's safe or unsafe to express? And what practices help me move from reactivity to reflection when I feel triggered? Any to add, Phil, or any commentary on those questions?
No, I think those 93 are perfect.
Yeah, there's quite a few. I think it's to give people a breadth and depth of ideas to think on which one. I know there were two that specifically stand out to me, which is what's one small way I can signal safety to someone else this week? And then two, whose protective patterns frustrate me most and how might I see that as fear, not defiance? Because that's specifically what I'm going through, but someone else might experience one of the other 94 questions that we shared today. So today, that's all we have on protection. It's the brain's first job is to keep us safe, as we've shared, and this is the first of the 5 driving forces of our brain. And we appreciate you tuning in to listen to the information on this podcast today. Thank you for being loyal listeners. Share, like, comment, subscribe, whether it's on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or it's on any of our social media platforms at My Brainwise Coach. The best way that you can help us out is to share this information with your loved ones, share this at work. It can be used anywhere and everywhere that you might choose to share it to help others begin to decode their life. And as always, if you have questions, comments, send them in to questions@mybrainwisecoach.com. And again, comment, share, and subscribe wherever it is that you get your podcast, and we'll see you next week.